Hi all, it's KB. This is part 3 and the last part to combination knitting patterns. We'll apply what we've learned so far to real life scenarios. We're going to start with just a little recap. Because of the way we wrap knit stitches, we produce a Western stitch. The right stitch leg is in the front, left leg in the back. This is also called the leading leg. Now, I just want to point something out. Let's pretend I'm at the end of my row and I turn my work. This is still a Western stitch. My right stitch leg now is in the front of the needle, even though I turned my work. So our stitches look the same from behind as they do in the front. So that's why I can point out that I've just created a Western stitch. Now, when we purl, because of the way we wrap, we create an Eastern stitch. I'm going to transfer it here so we can see it a little better, but my leading leg is in the back now. I am working flat, stockinette stitch. That means when I get to the end of the row, I will turn my work and I will purl back. I will finish knitting across this row. Whoops. It's hard to knit when people are looking at you. Now I will turn my knitting and I will purl back across this row. My first stitch of every new row, I take great pains to make sure that I knit it a little tighter, just to keep my edges nice and tidy. So as you can see here, I have Western stitches. They were produced by knitting, doing that counterclockwise wrap. So I will just knit across, or purl across, I'm sorry. I purled and I have produced Eastern stitches because of the direction I wrapped as I purled. So here are my Eastern stitches once again. And I'm just knitting into the right stitch leg. Things change a little bit for us when we work in the round. Working in the round means I'm just using double points, but you could also use a circular needle. And you're going to work around in circles. So instead of doing rows, we're doing rounds. And that means that we won't be actually turning our work this way. We'll just be going around in a circle. So that changes up the rhythm that we'll get into. Let's take a look at stockinette stitch. Western stitches here. So I'm working into my right stitch leg. And I've come to the end of my round. I'm starting my new round. So I know that all of these stitches are going to be Western stitches. And I know that my right stitch leg is in the front. So when you're working stockinette stitch in the round, essentially, you're just going to be doing Western stitches, kind of a conventional knit stitch, all the way around, every round. So it's a little different than producing stockinette stitch in the flat. And this is why. Let's do garter stitch now. So I've knitted across already, producing Western stitches. So when I turn my work, now I'm going to knit and create that ridged look. So I am working through the right stitch leg because Western stitches. And at the end, I have knitted, so I have produced Western stitches. Here I kind of have the start of my garter ridge. Western stitches, so I know that my right stitch leg is right here. So essentially, when we're working garter stitch flat, we're knitting every row, and we expect, because we're knitting every row, that our right stitch leg will be in front. All right, let's take a look at garter stitch in the round. So it really changes things up. In the round, to produce garter stitch, you have to knit one row, purl the next row. Knit one row, purl the next row in the round. So a little different. So right now, I know that I have Western stitches because I just knitted a row. And I'm going to always have, when I'm doing garter stitch in the round, I'm always going to have Western stitches as I purl, so I can just do the combination purl here. Elizabeth Zimmerman called this the easy purl. So here I am at the front of my round. And I've just purled all these stitches. When I purl, I produce Eastern stitches. So I'll just work into my right stitch and I'll knit across. And I'm at the beginning of my round again. Finishing a knitting round, so now I will purl. And because I finished a knitting round, I know that these are Western stitches. So I will work into my right stitch leg and purl around. So it's kind of interesting how knitting flat or knitting in the round changes what kind of a rhythm we'll get into. Let's do a 2x2 ribbing now. First working flat, So I'm gonna knit, and because I start out here with a Eastern stitch mount, so I'm gonna knit my knits and purl my purls. Western stitch mount, Eastern, it's kind of like stockinette stitch. I'm actually knitting the stitches that on the reverse side were purled, so I've created an Eastern stitch mount. On the other side, I've knitted these and created a Western stitch mount. So I will work into my right stitch leg. Now I'll turn my work, and now I knit my knit stitches, but because I had just purled them, I can anticipate an Eastern stitch mount, and I'll just work into my right stitch leg. Again, these were stitches that were knitted on the other side, so I'm working into my right stitch leg in the front of the needle. I'll turn my work. So I'm stacking columns of knit stitches, which are basically stockinette stitches, because as I'm knitting this column on this side, I'm purling it on the other. So when I come to my knit stitches, I can anticipate that this is where my right stitch leg is, and I can just work into the right stitch leg. Now when I come to my purl stitches, on this side, I'm stacking purl stitches, but when I worked them on the reverse side, I knitted them. So I can anticipate that these are Western stitches, and my right stitch leg is on the front of the needle, and I can work them like this. So if you're doing ribbing, you'll just get into, ribbing flat, I should say, just get into your rhythm. You won't really have to think much about it. Two by two rib. And let's look at 2 by 2 ribbing in the round. Western stitch, right leg stitch in front. And because I'm stacking now purls directly on top of purls, when we purl, we create Eastern stitches. So when I purl, I'm always going to be purling into that right stitch leg, which is right there. And the same goes for my knit stitches. because I'm not turning my work, I'm directly stacking knit stitches on knit stitches. So I'm always going to be knitting Western stitches and purling. Whoops, I screwed up that stitch, sorry. I'm always going to be purling Eastern stitches. So that is 2x2 ribbing. I don't know if you can see that 2x2 ribbing in the round. Now I hope your takeaway is that when we were looking at identifying stitch mount and where the right stitch leg is, that you'd have to look at each stitch individually and they'd just be popping up at random places. But no, you're following a rhythm or a pattern, and you just get into that pattern and you can anticipate where your right stitch leg is going to be. It's just that in different knitting scenarios, the right stitch may be in the front of the needle or in back of the needle. So I hope this gives you kind of an idea of why that is, and enjoy your knitting. So thanks for watching. Want to remind you that knitting is knitting. Don't be afraid to knit different.